with a facial recognition company, Clearview AI, for violating the rights of Illinois residents, and the company must now offer residents an opt-out mechanism. Today, our focus will be on how technological solutions can secure our privacy while allowing us to enjoy the benefits of biometric tools. Biometric privacy enhancing technologies can and should be implemented along with biometric technologies. So-called BPATs, these so-called BPATs can be implemented at the point of capture, improving the precision of collection tools to ensure that they are not picking up features that are not necessary for use. They can insert, for example, obfuscations on the data collected, degrading the quality of the information or introducing statistical noise so that the biometric data is less usable for unintended uses. A technique called template protection can ensure that one system's biometric information is encrypted such that it cannot be read by another system. For example, someone's image obtained from the security systems at a doctor's or psychiatrist's office, for example, cannot be linked to the worker's workplace identity verification system. Federal agencies, including NIST, who's represented at this hearing today, as well as DHS's Science and Technology Director, are already working to develop and improve privacy protecting technologies for biometric technologies. The America Competes Act, which I'm helping to conference with and with the Senate, contains a number of provisions that will future-proof the government's definitions and standards for biometric identification systems and invest in privacy-enhancing technologies. I look forward to hearing from our panel how we can further invest in these protections as biometric technologies become more and more prevalent in our daily lives. And the timing of our discussion today is notable. The Supreme Court has recently substantially weakened the constitutional right to privacy in their recent decision overturning Roe v. Wade. And states attempting to criminalize access to medical care may try to use biometric data to prove where someone has been and what they did when they were there. And third parties may also try to access biometric information to collect the bounties now being offered by some states to enforce their new laws. And this makes protecting Americans' biometric data more important than ever. And finally, I just want to observe that some of our witnesses' testimony came a little bit late for this hearing, and I apologize to the other members and of the subcommittee that we didn't have the usual amount of time as we would normally like to have had to prepare. And the chair will now recognize ranking member of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, Mr. Obernolte, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Foster. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited about our hearing this morning on the benefits and risks of biometric technologies and exploring research opportunities in these technologies. I'm really hoping that this hearing turns into a productive discussion that helps us learn about ways to improve biometric technologies in the future, at the same time protecting people's privacy. I was reflecting this morning on the fact that biometric technology have really changed the way that we live our lives. Just this morning, I used facial recognition to open my phone, used the fingerprint reader on my computer to open my MacBook. When I got in my car this morning to come to my district office, the car recognized my face to set the seat settings, and as I was driving, used facial recognition to make sure that I was paying attention to the road. And that's just in the first couple of hours of today. So it's definitely changed our lives, and it's amazing to think that this was once the world of science fiction, and now we just take it completely for granted. Obviously, biometrics bring a lot of benefits to our daily lives, and we want to make sure that we're able to continue to allow those benefits while protecting the privacy of the people that rely on biometrics. So for that reason, I am particularly glad that Dr. Romine from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies is with us here today to talk about the work that NIST is doing in this space. NIST has been working in research and development in biometrics for over 60 years. They have had an incredible role to play in developing standards for biometrics. And I'm hoping that in the same way that they helped the FBI establish standards for fingerprint technologies in the 1960s, that they're going to be able to take a leadership role in establishing standards at the national, international level for biometrics today. These standards are going to be critical to enable the exchange of biometric data between agencies and their systems, as well as providing guidance for how those biometric systems are tested, how performance is measured, and how assurances are made that data is shared securely and that privacy is protected. That's important because, I mean, as we all know, biometrics are really no different than any other advanced technology in that they have beneficial uses, but also their misuse can harm individuals and harm our society, in this case, by compromising the privacy of individuals or the security of their information. So as policymakers, we need to be acutely aware of not only the benefits that these biometrics have to our society, but also of the risks associated with the technology, especially in my opinion, when it comes to the covert collection and the issue of individual consent to have one's information stored and used. I think as policymakers, we have to balance that awareness against the potential benefits that biometrics bring to society. You could easily imagine us taking a draconian approach to regulating biometrics that effectively prevents the development and use of biometrics, which would lose all of the benefits that we enjoy from biometrics. And I'm not just talking about unlocking our phones or setting the seats on our cars. Biometric technologies really have extraordinarily helpful applications. To give you a couple of examples, in Ukraine, the Defense Ministry is using Clearview AI's facial recognition technology to recognize Russian assailants and identify dead combatants. Marinus analytics tool Traffic Jam uses facial recognition and AI to detect patterns in sex trafficking ads to help law enforcement identify victims of sex trafficking. If we were to take an overly heavy-handed approach to regulating biometrics, we would lose out on those life-saving applications as well. And that's something I actually have some firsthand experience with. Before serving in Congress, I was a member of the California State Legislature, and I served on the Committee for Privacy and Consumer Protection in the early days of facial recognition, before the risks and the benefits of the technology were well understood. And I can tell you, we saw a lot of bills that were misguided proposals that could have effectively banned the use of facial recognition technology altogether. So it's clear that it's a lot easier for us to push for legislation to outlaw technology entirely than it is to conduct due diligence and try to intelligently balance the benefits against the risks of technology. And that's actually why the work of NIST is so valuable here. A better understanding of the technology and carefully developed safeguards and standards will help us develop biometrics in a way that provides safety for people's privacy without stifling the innovation that's going to lead to future breakthroughs and benefits to society. So looking very much forward to learning about their work today and to hearing from our witnesses. Thank you, Chairman Foster, for convening the hearing. I am very much looking forward to the discussion, and I yield back.
Thank you. And I have to say, I'm very much envious of the car that you must be driving with all those features. It must be, I would wager you probably aren't driving around in a 10-year-old Ford Focus.
Well, you know, actually, that technology is coming to inexpensive cars as well. It's amazing.
Oh, that's right. Yep. Anyway, if there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Candice Wright. Ms. Wright is a director in GAO's Science, Technology, Assessment, and Analytics team. She oversees GAO's work on federally funded research, intellectual property protection and management, and federal efforts to help commercialize innovative technologies and enhance U.S. economic competitiveness. Since joining GAO in 2004, Ms. Wright has led reviews on a wide variety of policy issues involving federal contracting, risks to the defense supplier base, foreign military sales, and homeland security. After Ms. Wright is Dr. Charles Romine. Dr. Romine is a director of Information Technology Laboratory, ITL. ITL is one of 6 research laboratories within the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Dr. Romine oversees a research program that cultivates trusted information technology and metrology by developing and disseminating standards, measurements, and testing for interoperability, security, usability, and reliability of information systems. Our final witness is Dr. Arun Ross. Dr. Ross is a professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Michigan State University, East Lansing. He also serves as MSU's site director of the NSF Center for Identification Technology and Research. His experience is in biometrics, computer vision, and machine learning. Dr. Ross has advocated for the responsible use of biometrics in multiple forums, including the NATO Advanced Research Workshop on Identity and Security. And as our witnesses should know, each of you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. When you've completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel, and if time permits, we may in fact have 2 rounds of questions for our panel. And so we will start with Ms. Wright. And whoops, you'll have to unmute, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's work on federal agencies' use of biometric technologies, particularly for facial recognition. The technology, which measures and analyzes physical and behavioral characteristics, is used to compare facial images from a photo or video for identification and verification. As the technology has continued to rapidly advance, its use has expanded in both the commercial and government sector. Today, I will share highlights from our work on how agencies are using facial recognition and federal efforts to assess and mitigate privacy risks. Last year, we reported on the results of our survey of the 24 largest agencies and their use of facial recognition technology. 18 agencies reported using the technology. The most common use was unlocking smartphones provided by agencies. There were other uses that included domestic law enforcement to generate leads for criminal investigations, as well as monitoring or controlling access to a building or facility to, for example, identify if someone on a watch list is attempting to gain access. Such use can greatly reduce the burden on security personnel to memorize faces. Federal agencies may own their own systems or access the systems of state and local governments or commercial providers to conduct searches of facial images. Agencies noted that some systems can include hundreds of millions or even billions of photos. Multiple agencies reported accessing systems owned by commercial vendors. For example, DHS reported using Clearview AI to identify victims and perpetrators in child exploitation cases. Agencies are investing in research and development to further their understanding and application of the technology. Some examples include DHS's Science and Technology Directorate, which sponsored technology challenges for industry to develop systems. One recent challenge was to reliably collect or match images of individuals wearing masks. In addition, NSF has awarded grants to research methods to prevent identifying an individual from facial images used in research. With its expanded use in the federal government, there are concerns about the accuracy of the technology, data security risks, the transparency in its usage, and the protection of privacy and civil liberties. In our survey of law enforcement agencies, some agencies did not have complete information on what non-federal systems are being used by their employees. In fact, during the course of our work, multiple agencies had to poll their employees and discovered they were using non-federal systems, even though the agency initially told us otherwise. Using facial recognition systems without first assessing the privacy implications and applicable privacy requirements can put agencies at risk of running afoul of privacy-related laws, regulations, and guidance. There are also risks that data sets with personal information could be compromised in a data breach or be shared with unauthorized individuals. Unlike a password, which can be changed if breached, a breach involving data derived from a face may have more serious consequences as the facial image is more permanent. We recommended that agencies improve their process to track the facial recognition systems used by their employees and assess the risks of such systems. Agencies are in varying stages of implementing our recommendations. In our work examining biometric privacy practices at TSA and CBP, we found that TSA had incorporated privacy protections for its pilot program to test the use of the technology for traveler identity verification at airport security checkpoints. However, CBP's privacy notices to inform the public of facial recognition use in its biometric entry-exit program were not always current or complete. Further, CBP had not conducted audits of its commercial airline and airport partners to ensure compliance with CBP's own requirements on restrictions for retaining or using traveler photos. Fully implementing our recommendations will be an important step to protect travelers' information. In closing, facial recognition technology is not going away, and demand for it will likely continue to grow. As agencies continue to find utility in the technology to meet their mission, balancing the benefits of the technology with data security requirements and privacy protections will continue to be important. Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my remarks. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. And next is Dr. Romine.
Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'm Charles Romine, the Director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the Department of Commerce's National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of NIST on our efforts to evaluate the privacy implications of biometrics technologies. NIST is home to 5 Nobel Prize winners with programs focused on national priorities such as artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, the digital economy, precision metrology, quantum information science, biosciences, and cybersecurity. The mission of NIST is to promote U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness by advancing measurement science, standards, and technology in ways that enhance economic security and improve our quality of life. In the NIST Information Technology Laboratory, we work to cultivate trust in information technology and metrology. Trust in the digital economy is built upon key principles like cybersecurity, privacy, interoperability, equity, and avoiding bias in the development and deployment of technology. NIST conducts fundamental and applied research, advances standards to understand and measure technology, and develops tools to evaluate such measurements. Technology standards and the foundational research that enables their development and use are critical to advancing trust in and promoting interoperability between digital products and services. Critically, they can provide increased assurance, thus enabling more secure, private, and rights-preserving technologies. With robust collaboration with stakeholders across government, industry, international bodies, and academia, NIST aims to cultivate trust and foster an environment that enables innovation on a global scale. Since its establishment nearly a decade ago, NIST's privacy engineering program's mission has been to support the development of trustworthy information systems by applying measurement science and system engineering principles to the creation of frameworks, risk models, guidance, tools, and standards that protect privacy and, by extension, civil liberties. The ability to conduct thorough privacy risk assessments is essential for organizations to select effective mitigation measures, including appropriate privacy-enhancing technologies. Modeled after NIST's highly successful cybersecurity framework, the NIST Privacy Framework is another voluntary tool developed in collaboration with stakeholders through a public and transparent process. It is intended to support organizations' decision-making in product and service design or deployment to optimize beneficial uses of data while minimizing adverse consequences for individuals' privacy and for society as a whole. Since the 1980s, NIST has coordinated development of the ANSI NIST ITL standard data format for the interchange of fingerprint, facial, and other biometric information, for interchange of biometric data in law enforcement applications, extending the modalities from fingerprint to include face, iris, voice, and DNA. The standard is used globally by law enforcement, homeland security, defense, intelligence agencies, and other identity management systems and owners and developers to ensure biometric information interchanges are interoperable and maintain system integrity and efficiency. Since 2002, NIST has also supported development of international standards for data interchange in primarily civil applications, including ID cards, including e-passports. Different uses of biometrics, for example, as authenticators to protect access to sensitive data or convenient entry solutions and fraud prevention, give rise to different degrees of privacy risk. Organizations need to have the means to be able to distinguish between the different degrees of privacy risk and implement appropriate mitigation measures. The NIST privacy framework provides the structure for organizations to consider which privacy protective outcomes are suitable to their use cases. The research on privacy enhancing technologies that NIST conducts and the guidelines and standards that NIST publishes helps organizations in implementing effective mitigations appropriately tailored to identified risks. Privacy plays a critical role in safeguarding fundamental values such as human autonomy and dignity, as well as civil rights and civil liberties. NIST has prioritized measurement science research and the creation of frameworks, guidance, tools, and standards that protect privacy. In addition to maintaining the NIST privacy framework, NIST also includes privacy considerations in many of NIST's critical cybersecurity guidelines, as well as the draft AI risk management framework. Thank you for the opportunity to present on NIST activities on privacy enhancing technologies for biometric applications, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And after Dr. Romine is Dr. Ross.
Respected Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, and esteemed members of the subcommittee, I'm grateful for the invitation to testify today. I consider this to be a great privilege and honor to engage with the corridors of power that so graciously serve our nation. Biometrics is a valuable technology that has broad applications in a number of different domains. However, it is necessary to ensure that the privacy of individuals is not unduly compromised when their biometric data are used in a certain application. The purpose of my testimony is to communicate some of the ways in which the privacy of the biometric data of individuals can be enhanced, thereby facilitating the responsible use of this powerful technology. Firstly, then, the benefits of biometrics. The need for reliably determining the identity of a person is critical in a vast number of applications, ranging from personal smartphones to border security, from self-driving vehicles to e-voting, tracking child vaccinations to preventing human trafficking, crime scene investigation to personalization of customer service. Biometrics is increasingly being used in several such applications. For instance, many smartphones employ automated face or fingerprint recognition for unlocking and payment authentication purposes. This increased use of biometric technology is being driven by significant improvement in recognition accuracy of these systems over the past decade. Indeed, the phenomenal rise of the paradigm of deep learning based on neural networks has fundamentally changed the landscape of face recognition and biometrics. But this brings me to my second point, the privacy concerns associated with the technology. For example, face images of an individual can be linked across different applications using biometric technology, thereby creating a comprehensive profile of that individual, or in some cases, unintentionally divulging the person's identity where privacy was expected. Another example, rapid advances in the field of machine learning and AI have led to the development of so-called attribute classifiers that can automatically extract information pertaining to age, sex, race, and health cues from images. This can potentially breach the privacy of individuals. One more example, a number of face data sets have been curated for research purposes by scraping publicly available face images from the web. Legitimate concerns have been expressed about using these images for research purposes without user consent. In principle, therefore, an anonymous face image can be linked to one or more face images in a curated data set, thereby potentially revealing the identity of the anonymous face. Now to my final point. How can biometric technology be responsibly developed and deployed while keeping privacy in mind? Firstly, by utilizing schemes such as homomorphic encryption, which not only ensure that the original biometric data is never revealed, but that all computations take place in the encrypted domain. Secondly, by engaging a paradigm called cancelable biometrics, where the biometric data of an individual is intentionally distorted using a mathematical function. The distorted data can still be successfully used for biometric recognition purposes, but within a certain application. This preempts the possibility of linking the biometric data of an individual across applications. Thirdly, by perturbing a face image in such a way that its biometric utility is retained, but the ability to extract additional attributes pertaining to age, sex, race, or health is obscured. Fourthly, by making it more difficult for face images to be scraped from public websites and social media profiles. Fifthly, by deploying privacy-preserving cameras where the acquired images are not interpretable by a human and can only be used within a specific application. Such cameras, when used in public spaces, can ensure that the acquired images are not viable for previously unspecified purposes. In addition, I must note that academic researchers in biometrics are becoming increasingly aware of the privacy and ethical implications of the technology they are developing. This means that recognition accuracy is not the only metric being used to evaluate the overall performance of a biometric system. Rather, metrics related to security and privacy are also being increasingly considered. This shift in the research culture is remarkable and bodes well for the future of the technology. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Well, thank you. And at this point, we will begin our first round of questions. So the chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes. First, on the prospects for a secure and privacy-preserving digital ID. Though we're all aware of some concerning aspects of biometric technologies, it's important to recognize that there are valuable uses for these technologies that can improve our lives and security. Now, privacy protections must evolve along with biometric capabilities so that we can reap the benefits safely. With our Improving Digital Identity Act of 2021, I and a bipartisan group of colleagues have called upon federal agencies to modernize and harmonize our nation's digital identity infrastructure, in large part by leveraging the existing biometric databases that individual states already have in place as part of their programs to support the Real ID, but additionally using NIST standards to make sure that these identity tools are interoperable and can be used for presenting that identity both online and offline in a privacy-preserving way. So first, Dr. Romine, how could biometric technologies increase our privacy by making our identities more secure against theft and fraud?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly appreciate the concern that you and the ranking member have on this issue, and I'm delighted to be here, excuse me, talking about this today. The guidelines that we have put in place for privacy-enhancing technologies, broadly speaking, we have investments in our privacy engineering program related to understanding how we can develop new technologies that can enhance privacy protections in many different aspects of technologies. And that coupled with the guidance that we are updating today on identity management and appropriate protections for identity management technologies, I think there are going to be certainly opportunities to improve, as you point out, the protections of biometrics information across the board through some of these updated guidelines. And I look forward to discussing that with you and your staff further.
Thank you. And so obviously any broad implementation of biometric identification techniques would require commensurately broad implementation of privacy protective measures. So what are the so-called BPET methods? How could they be strengthened? Are they really ready for prime time? Things like homomorphic encryption, I've been told that there's still a privacy budget that you have to enforce, that you can't sit there and interrogate this using homomorphic decryption. You can't just do it repeatedly without at some point revealing the underlying database. So there must be limits to these. And have we pretty much understood and hit the limits of these, or is there a lot of work yet to be done to understand how effective it can be to exchange information between trusted entities without revealing everything?
Well, thank you, sir. A very short time ago, homomorphic encryption was a theoretical idea whose performance was so unbelievably slow that it was not practical. Since then, enormous strides have been made in improving the performance. But I will say that these privacy-enhancing technologies, particularly using cryptography as a protection mechanism, have enormous potential, but there's still a lot more work to be done in enhancing those to make them significantly practical. And as you point out, there are situations in which even with an obscured database through encryption that's queryable, if you provide enough queries and have a machine learning back end to take a look at the responses, you can begin to infer some information. So we're still in the process of understanding the specific capabilities that encryption technologies such as homomorphic encryption can provide in support.
Thank you. And Dr. Ross, do you have any comments on this? And particularly the fascinating idea that you can cancel your fingerprints in some sense. How does that work, and does it really work yet?
Yes, thank you for your question, Chairman Foster. So cancelable biometrics has been proposed as one way to both preserve the security and privacy of the biometric data, but also the ability to cancel one's biometric template. The way it works is as follows. Let's say you have a fingerprint image. Now you subject it to some distortions using a mathematical function, and the distorted image is then used for matching purposes. In other words, if the particular image is compromised, then you would just change the mathematical function. And therefore you cancel the original template, if you will, and now you generate a new fingerprint template based on this revised mathematical function. And so in principle, this can allow us to not store the person's original fingerprint, but only the distorted version or the transformed version of the fingerprint. And that's why the cancelable property, which is really imparted by merely changing the transformation function. Now to your question about evaluation.
Now, I'm afraid I don't want to abuse my time limit here, which has expired, but I believe we should be able to get to a second round. We may return. So at this point, I'll now recognize Congress's other AI programmer, our ranking member, Representative Obernolte, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Foster. Thanks to our witnesses. It's been a really interesting hearing, and I'm looking forward to the questions. I've been reflecting on the fact that when we talk about privacy, it really is a non-binary ethical problem, right? You can't say that data is completely private or data is not. We're dealing with this strange kind of continuum where we have to weigh the amount of privacy we're willing to give up against the potential benefit that we expect by giving up that privacy. And it's a complicated thing. So I'd like to kind of organize my questions around that, because I think solving that problem is going to be key to establishing a regulatory framework of what's expected when we ask companies to protect privacy. So Ms. Wright, I think I'll start with you with a question. I'm really, really happy to see the GAO participate in this hearing. And, I think that this is, it sends a powerful statement to those that we intend to regulate when we start with ourselves in government, because obviously we interact with a lot of data from a lot of different users, and we ought to be experimenting on ourselves on solving this problem before we expect others to solve it. So I found your testimony really compelling. I have to admit, I was very alarmed when I read that 13 out of the 14 agencies you surveyed did not have complete information about their own use of facial recognition technology. But then I tunneled a little more, and I realized that most of those were people using facial recognition technology to unlock their own smartphones, things like that. So it made me think about the fact that maybe there's a difference between privacy when it comes to our own data. I'm using my face to unlock my phone. And the privacy when we're using other people's data, especially when we have a large amount of data. So do you think that we need to, when we do these surveys in the future, that we need to make a distinguishment between those different kinds of uses?
I certainly think that that's really important. With the case of where we found agencies didn't know what their own employees were using, it was actually the use of non-federal systems to conduct facial image searches, such as for law enforcement purposes. And so in those scenarios, what was happening is perhaps the folks at headquarters didn't really have a good sense of what was happening in the regional and local offices. And that's where we think it's really important for agencies to have a good understanding of what are the systems that are being used and for what purposes, and then to also make sure that by accounting for that and inventorying that, they then have the necessary tools to ensure that they're balancing the potential privacy risks associated with using those systems.
Okay. I mean, isn't all of these things, if you're using, a commercial source for this kind of technology, it has to go through procurement, right? Would procurement maybe be a fruitful avenue to look at in terms of informing this flow of information?
Certainly, there were a couple of different scenarios. One in which agencies might have been accessing state and local systems or commercial systems through a test or trial period. And then there also might be instances where they actually have an acquisition or procurement in place. We actually have some ongoing work right now that's looking again at at law enforcement's use and the kinds of mechanisms that they're using in acquiring systems from commercial vendors. So I think that information is going to be really telling for us to understand what sorts of privacy requirements are being put in place when agencies are acquiring services from these commercial vendors.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, Dr. Romine, I found it really interesting in your written testimony when you we're talking about the privacy framework and the fact that it's not a static thing. It's not binary, which is very much in keeping with the way that I look at it as well. So could you talk a little bit about how you would evaluate the fact that this has to be dynamic? I mean, for example, I think part of it has to be based on use, right? If you're using facial recognition for verification, that's a different use case than identification. So, and I think a user's expectations on privacy are going to be different. So how do you approach that kind of ethical conundrum?
That's exactly right. I think you've hit it on the head in the sense that the context of use is critical to understanding the level of risk associated with privacy considerations. One of the things that our guidance is intended to do, and the privacy framework is intended to do, is give organizations the ability to establish privacy risk management principles as part of their overall risk management for the enterprise. You talk about reputational risk and financial risk and human factors risk or human capital risk. And privacy risk hasn't been included typically in that. And so we're giving organizations the tools now to understand that data gathered for one purpose, when it's translated to a different purpose, in the case of biometrics, can have a completely different risk profile associated with it. So it isn't inherent in the data, it's the context in which that data are being used, those data are being used. So our tools allow for a deeper understanding on the part of the organizations on that context issue.
Sure. Well, I see I'm out of time. If we get another round here, I'm going to ask you about scope creep, because that's going to fit right into what we're talking about framework. But thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. And we will now recognize Representative Carey for 5 minutes. Mike, oh, you're passing. Okay, we will recognize Representative Weiss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Obernolte. I have a couple of questions that I just want to touch on. This is a topic of conversation that has come up in Oklahoma a couple of times on the state side. Ms. Wright, you testified that most agencies accessing non-federal facial recognition technology don't track use or access related to privacy risks. As far as you are aware, is there any federal law that requires agencies to track this information?
So there's a broad privacy framework, I guess I'll say, where you have the Privacy Act that does call for agencies to limit how their collection as well as disclosure and use of personal information in a government system. And so a photo would be considered an example of personal information. You also have the E-Government Act as well, which does include provisions for agencies to conduct privacy impact assessments when they're using systems. And again, that's to be able to use those privacy impact assessments to analyze how the information is collected, how it's stored and shared and managed in a federal system. And then lastly, I'll just note that when we spoke with OMB, they had noted that agencies must ensure that privacy requirements apply to any systems that are being operated by contractors on behalf of federal agencies.
And actually, we haven't even talked about the contractor piece, which is sort of an interesting tag along. But I want to circle back around to your comment about these assessments. Do you think that agencies are doing the assessments? And if so, what are those outcomes sort of published so that other agencies can understand maybe risks or the breadth of what they're utilizing within the agencies?
We've seen a mix of how agencies are approaching the privacy impact assessments. I think in my statement earlier, one of the things I mentioned was, when you have agencies who are using systems and their agencies, employees who are using systems and their agencies aren't even aware, then there's the likelihood that those privacy impact assessments or any other privacy risks have not been assessed. And we think that that's a really important thing for agencies to be keeping in mind as they are continuing to use facial recognition systems.
Do you think it would be helpful for Congress to look at requiring these assessments to be done maybe on a periodic basis for agencies that are utilizing these types of biometrics?
So again, the E-Government Act calls for agencies to do that, but the extent to which they're doing that really varies. And so perhaps that's work that we could talk about, if there's oversight opportunities there to look at the extent to which they're using privacy impact assessments, especially in the realm of biometric.
Perfect. And what do you think some of the potential adverse consequences might be of agencies failing to track information either themselves or through third-party systems?
So a couple of things come to mind is one, are they using systems that have reliable data, that have quality images that will then affect the sorts of matching results that will come back and the extent to which those can be trusted? You could see where there's a potential for a high mismatch error rate, which then might mean in a law enforcement example, where you might be chasing down a lead that isn't going to be fruitful, or you might be missing an opportunity to chase down a lead. So I think that that's one thing, one piece of it. The other piece too is when we're thinking about this from a privacy perspective is how are the images being collected and how are they being used? And does the individual have any say? Do they provide any consent, for example, to their photo being captured and then used in this way? So there's certainly a number of different risks associated. There's certainly the issue of data security. Are the systems that are being used secure? We've had cybersecurity as a high-risk area on the GAO high-risk list for many, many years within the federal government. And so you can imagine, this only opens up the door to the potential for even greater security breaches.
And I would say sitting on the cyber subcommittee under House Armed Services, I think you're exactly right. We talk about this from sort of a data privacy perspective, but we also need to recognize that there's certainly a huge potential for cybersecurity challenges when you're collecting these types of biometrics and storing them either through a third party, which I think in some cases could be maybe more of an issue, but certainly, if agencies are actually storing that information themselves. So my time is almost expired. So Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And I believe we will have time for a second round of questions here. And so I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Wright, it is, I guess, abundantly clear that the U.S. taxpayer has suffered greatly from identity fraud in everything from, IRS refund fraud to, unemployment benefit fraud during COVID, you name it. Has anyone, to your knowledge, inside GAO or elsewhere, just netted out the total loss to the federal government from identity fraud that might be prevented with using sort of state-of-the-art identity proofing mechanisms?
That's certainly not something that came up in the course of the recent work that we've done, and I'm not aware, but certainly happy to take that back and follow up with you on that.
Yeah, so I think we'll be asking you for the record, sort of, what the scope of such a survey would be, because there appear to be just little bits and pieces of documentation of the enormous losses that the taxpayer suffers from this, and so trying to get that balance right too, I think could be an important outcome here.
Certainly happy to do that.
Yeah. Secondly, one of the tough things that we're going to face as a government is sharing data with other governments. If you talk about biometric databases or the difficulty of regulating crypto, where you're ultimately going to need to have, a uniquely identified, biometrically deduped crypto driver's license, as it were, if you're really going to prevent it from being used for ransomware and all this sort of thing. So that's going to involve setting up, very much like, I guess, a passport system, something where you have to identify that someone is operating multiple identities in multiple jurisdictions. And actually, Dr. Ross, are you familiar with sort of the state of the art and what may be useful there? Are there investments that we can make towards more research that would allow you to ask very sensitive questions of big databases that are owned by other states or other governments?
Certainly. And I think one concept that can be harnessed, but which has to be further researched, is the notion of differential privacy, which would indicate that within a certain jurisdiction, you're able to do certain identity assessments using biometrics, and you have specific use cases, specific purposes in which identity can be matched, but in other cases, the identity cannot be matched. And so by defining the policies, one could then use these principles that we alluded to earlier, including homomorphic encryption and including differential privacy, in order to ensure that that kind of functionality can be performed. However, I must note that research is still in its infancy in the context of biometrics, and certainly more investment is definitely needed in order to assess the suitability of this in operational environments. And so further collaboration and investment is definitely needed to implement these techniques in operational environments.
Thank you. Dr. Romine, when you're involved in international standard settings, which is part of this mission, do you get the feeling that the United States is leading the way, or are there peers around the world that are as sophisticated technologically in biometrics and in privacy preserving methods?
In the work that we're doing in the international standards arena surrounding identity management, we certainly believe we are leading in that space. There are certainly other like-minded countries that are partners with us that value democratic ideals and so on, and we strive to work closely with them, and they do have very strong technical capability in these areas as well.
Yeah, I've been struck that in at least some European nations, you have a right to know when any government official accesses your data, at least outside of criminal investigation. And so are these things that can be cryptographically guaranteed, or is that really an unsolvable problem if you understand my question? I dream of some technology that would allow you with cryptographic certainty to know that someone's touched your data.
It's certainly theoretically possible to use cryptography to address the concern there. I wouldn't call it foolproof necessarily. The history of advancing technologies is colored with many different sort of advances and risks, and the risks are addressed by new technologies which create additional risks. So the goal for us is just to ensure the trustworthiness of the underlying systems, and certainly cryptography can be an important ingredient there.
Yeah, Dr. Ross, did you have any thoughts on the feasibility of that as a long-term goal?
Yes, and I think it's an excellent question because one thing this entails is keeping a ledger of interactions between humans and the data that is being stored. For example, a blockchain principle has been used to keep track of certain transactions that have occurred, and these are immutable. So I believe that some of these principles can be leveraged into the field of biometrics, but I must maintain that more research is needed, more investment is needed, but certainly the technology is available, but then it has to be incorporated into the context of biometrics.
Thank you. My time for this round is expired, and I'll now recognize Representative Obernolte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Foster. Dr. Romine, we were having that discussion about the continuum of privacy and how that works ethically with our efforts to regulate it. And in your written testimony, you talked about scope creep, this idea that privacy can be violated when the scope of how biometric data is used differs from the expectation of the person who provided it. But I mean, that's ethically complex too, right? Because sometimes there are societally beneficial uses that we put that to. And a good example was the one we've been talking about with using Clearview AI to halt sex trafficking. And if you ask the people, that are saved from sex trafficking, they certainly didn't give permission for the use of their data in that context. But if you ask them if it's okay with them, they'd say, yes, please, right? So, how do you navigate that minefield?
That's a terrific question. One of the things to keep in mind is that, when you've acquired biometrics data for whatever purpose, any organization that's acquired such data, these are now assets in their control. And sometimes the pressure to use those assets in ways that weren't originally intended is pretty enormous. The idea that, hey, we could do this instead of thinking, should we do this with those data? So that's one of the reasons that we always have to stress the importance of context of use in these areas. And you're absolutely right. In some cases, a new context of use may be enormously beneficial and perhaps not even controversial. And in other cases, could be extremely potentially damaging. I want to say, by the way, this is the difference between cybersecurity and privacy, in the sense that a cybersecurity event does not have to take place for privacy harms to occur. Simply using, in this case, biometrics data in ways that were not intended and perhaps violate the expectations of those who've provided those data can create those privacy events.
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, I want to ask a question about that to Dr. Ross. You're in your written testimony, you were talking about privacy violations that can occur with using facial recognition to infer racial, sexual, or health characteristics that weren't intended by the person who provided the data, which I thought was really interesting. But how do you navigate that in an ethical sense? Because when I post a picture of myself on Facebook, and one of my friends looks at that and says, boy, he really looks unwell, right? I can't then point my finger at them and say, hey, that's a privacy violation. I didn't intend for you to infer anything about my health. They would just roll their eyes, right? Because it's understood. My picture is out there. And, and those inferences can be made by anyone who sees it. So why do we make a distinction between that that use when a human does it and when a machine does it?
Thank you. Again, an excellent question. So we are really distinguishing between human-based analytics versus machine-based analytics. And when you employ a machine to do this, then you can do this en masse. You can have billions of images. You can run the software over these billions of images and then make some assessments in the aggregate without user consent. And so it is the ability to do this repeatedly over massive amounts of data and then use that aggregate in order to, say, perform additional activities that were not indicated to the user. That is where the problem lies. If the user were to give consent saying that, yes, these images can be used for further analytics, then I believe that using the machine will be productive in some cases, but in other cases, as you point out, there might be a violation of privacy. I think it all boils down to user consent. and also the fact that you can do this en masse. And so how do we do this in a manner that the person is aware of on how their data is being used, and in a manner that does not unwittingly glean additional pieces of information that might violate their privacy.
Right. Yeah, I somewhat agree. I think that the distinction is not the amount of data that's processed, but the inferences that can be made that might be unintuitive to the person providing the data. And quickly here, another question for you, Dr. Ross, before I run out of time. You talked a lot in your testimony about privacy by design, which I think is a really elegant concept, but consider me a skeptic because, for example, if you're using an algorithm that distorts images in a way that sex or ethnicity can't be read, right? We're going to run into exactly the same problem, aren't we, that we did with cryptography, where cryptographic algorithms that were developed 10 years ago don't work anymore because computers are so much more powerful. As recognition technology gets better, aren't those algorithms not going to work anymore either?
A great point, very insightful comment. And I think this is where more mathematics is needed as we start developing biometric technology and deploying it. What we call as theoretical guarantees, understanding what the privacy leakages are, information leakage. And what is lacking here is privacy metrics, really. And privacy metrics, in some sense, is a moving target, because if technology cannot deduce some attribute from a face image today, it might be able to do it tomorrow. And so what is deemed to be private now, today, may no longer be deemed to be private tomorrow. And that is where the concern is. Mm-hmm. And this is why when the technology evolves and these collaborations are established, it must be revisited. It's not static in time. It is dynamic in time, because as technology advances, these policies must evolve, and also the metrics that are being used to evaluate must evolve. In short, I completely agree with your statement. Some of the problems in cryptography can potentially manifest itself in these other techniques, but it's not unsolvable. Right. I think with adequate technology development, especially employing mathematical transformations, I believe that a solution can be found.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion. Thank you for that. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I think there may actually be time for an additional round, that we'll see how things go. We'll now recognize Representative Perlmutter for 5 minutes.
I was hoping that Ms. Bice might go first, because I'm just catching up to all of you, and I'll never be able to catch up to Jay or Bill on this subject. But Stephanie, I can at least talk to her about it at softball. So anyway, I want to thank the panel. There was a word you used, Dr. Ross, immutable. And then you got into this conversation with Mr. Obernolte about the fact that, technology may make some of what we're trying to do today in terms of privacy and cybersecurity, outdated tomorrow. So it reminded me of a great Oklahoman, Will Rogers. It was about certainty, but I'll use it with immutability. The only thing that's immutable are death and taxes. So I guess my question is, and I'm really just a science fiction person when it comes to this, and is thinking of Minority Report with Tom Cruise, and you may have all kind of addressed that. I mean, every place he goes, they know him already, and eventually he has to have his eye taken out because of this. And I went and I bought an iPad holder from a company called WeatherTech the other day. We were in there for something else. I saw it looked good. So I bought the thing. All of a sudden, I am getting iPad holder ads like crazy, and I didn't even look for it online. I just bought the darn thing. So that's, I just feel like I've got either big business looking over my shoulder or big government looking over my shoulder. I'm making more of a statement than asking a question, but I guess, Ms. Wright, I'll start with you. I mean, is there anything, Dr. Romine was talking about, privacy versus cybersecurity. What can we do in the Congress to assure ourselves a little more privacy?
So I think a really key important factor is how do we hold, I'll start with federal government, how do we hold agencies accountable for the information that they're collecting, the purpose for which the information is being used, how it's being stored, shared, and destroyed. I think those are some really fundamental things to start with as we think about this issue of privacy. And then to really think about what applications or use cases we think should be permitted or restricted, because I think then you'll start to get a handle on, where the concerns are with respect to privacy. And again, at the end of the day, this is all about trade-offs. And while there might be some convenience factors, there might be some security benefits as well. There's also the issue of privacy and being able to protect your personal information. And I think that's where, the tension lies.
Well, and there's a tension too between the kind of privacy we might want from state or federal, local governments versus the kind of privacy we may want from private enterprise. The thing I ran into, it was a spontaneous purchase of this iPad holder, and all of a sudden I'm getting ads about it. So you've got two really sizable kind of entities out there that are looking over your shoulder. And I think we in the Congress need to, think about both of those when we're thinking about, particularly about privacy and about cybersecurity. So, gentlemen, anybody have a comment to my sort of general proposition here? It's not very much science-based, but it's personal-based.
I'd be happy to share some comments. So I think the issue that you're describing is actually very important, namely exchange of biometric data. Biometric data collected for one purpose can then be transmitted to another agency, to another entity, which might use it for a different purpose. And I think that is a legitimate concern. And one way in order to kind of prevent this, even before it happens, is by ensuring that when we store the biometric data in one entity, that it's suitably encrypted, suitably transformed. And when it is used in a different entity or by a different entity, it is encrypted differently or it is transformed differently. What happens here is then now these two sets of data cannot be linked because they have been transformed differently. And I think that becomes very important. Now, on the flip side, it might actually prevent, say, one agency from communicating with another agency because the biometric data cannot be linked. And this is where use case specific policies must be instituted. There are certain situations when it is acceptable. In other situations, like the one that you described, it is not acceptable. And this is where technological developments must be augmented with legislative instruments to engage the data in a manner that is appropriate in different use cases.
All right, thank you. My time has expired.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Representative Bice for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And for Representative Perlmutter, my friend and coach, I think part of that, I recognize the connections there. It is remarketing. Your email is likely tied to your credit card in some way, or you may have entered your email address when you checked out, and your email is tied to social media. And so then when they realized that you purchased that, they started marketing to you all sorts of things. And that's been going on for quite some time, but it is a little, I think for a lot of folks, concerning, because you begin to wonder, how did they know? How did they get this information? And that's big data at its finest. I want to talk here in Oklahoma. This last session, we passed House Bill 2968, the Computer Data Privacy Act. And the bill allows for the option for personal rights to be returned to the individual, along with the option for cancellation of the information in a private company's database. To me, this seems like it could be a solution for privately collected biometrics data. But this is to any of the witnesses here. What do you think are the most concerning aspects of developing biometric technology?
I would be happy to offer some comments, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And to both parts of your excellent question. I think one of the most obvious concerns about biometrics is the ability to link different data sets. And I think that clearly constitutes a problem in some cases. In other cases, it is an advantage. And once again, as the technology improves, as the recognition accuracy numbers improve, this kind of linking can be done with more certainty because the errors are decreasing. And I think this is where policies for regulating the use of the technology become important. In some use cases, it is absolutely essential to have that functionality. In some other cases, it may not be required. Secondly, in fact, in response to your first comment, again, an excellent comment, is when a user in a private enterprise offers their face image or fingerprint image, it would be nice if they can say for what purposes it can be used. For example, if it's a face image, they might say, well, you can use this for biometric recognition, but it should not be used for assessing, say, age or health cues. And the moment they specify that, the data should be transformed in a manner that would facilitate that functionality prior to storing it in a database. This gives some degree of control to the user because the user is now able to specify what kind of information can be gleaned and what kind of information should not be gleaned. And the technology is then being harnessed to impart this kind of functionality. And I think that is one important area in which more investment is needed. Many techniques have been proposed in the literature, but these have not been evaluated. The scalability of these things have to be assessed. And so there is a tremendous opportunity if we were to invest in this front. But excellent questions, and thank you for hearing me.
Thank you. Anyone else care to comment on that particular aspect?
I'd be happy to weigh in. Some of the challenges involve the ability to, as my colleague said, Dr. Ross said, to glean certain kinds of information and some of the potential societal harms or inequities that may occur as a result. I'll go back to the ranking member's question about his Facebook image and having a friend of his see it and say, wow, you don't look very good. Imagine if instead of his friend, it was an insurance company deciding, oh, wow, you don't look very good. And taking steps as a result of that assessment. Those are the kinds of societal harms that I think we need to be wary of.
Perfect. I think this is a really great point that use of those biometrics is incredibly important, and we need to be able to develop systems and controls to be able to allow for individuals to have some sort of say in how their information is utilized. Thank you for your time to the witnesses today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And I think we will now embark on actually a final round of questions and then close the hearing. And so I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes here. Yeah, Dr. Ross, you seem to be coming close to describing something that sort of resembled a licensing regime for collecting biometric data. That, let's say someone wanted to put a camera, facial recognition camera in front of their nightclub, to find people that had repeatedly shown up in the nightclub and caused violence. All right, sounds like a legitimate thing. But then if they start transferring that information around, then there are a bunch of issues that come up. And so are there standards? This might also be a question for Dr. Romine. Are there standards that are being mooted for how you would license the collecting of the data and also licensing the transferring the data? So that you'd actually, ultimately, if you're holding biometric data on someone, you would have to also be able to demonstrate a chain of custody that showed that you had achieved this, you had obtained this only through a set of licensed distributors of data with customer consent at each point. Have people gone that far, or any country gone in that direction?
Thank you for your question, Chairman Foster. I'll address the first question, and I assume my distinguished colleague will address the second part. So the first part, there is research that is being conducted in which privacy is being moved closer to the sensor than to the data. Because once the data is acquired, it is available. Yes, you can encrypt it, you can transform it, but someone has access to the data. What if we move the privacy aspect to the camera itself in such a way that the camera is designed in a manner that it can only extract or acquire rather specific aspects of the scene? And that becomes very important because nowhere will the digital version of the full scene be available. And so perturbing the images even prior to storing them at the sensor level might be one way in which the scenario that you described can be handled, because the data will no longer lend itself to be processed by a different organization or entity, because the data has already been perturbed at the time it was acquired by the camera. So that would be one technological solution. But as I mentioned earlier, these things have to be evaluated. And so much more research, much more investment, much more evaluation, these are needed in order to substantiate these principles.
And will this ultimately require, for some purposes, basically a government backdoor on this obfuscation? You know, for example, if you have cameras looking at elevators, just to make sure that you're opening and closing the elevators as fast as possible, where you only really have to detect the presence of a human. And then all of a sudden you find that some massive crime has been committed. The government might want to go to a trusted court system and say, okay, bypass the obfuscation. I want to see that person's face who is in the elevator. Are these necessary things, or are these policy options that we're going to have to face?
I think it will be a good mix of technological innovation and policy. There are ways in which the same data can be stored in different formats, different transformations, so that it can be used for some purposes and not for other purposes. So I think that technology can be applied in order to transform that data in different formats, but then individual formats should be guided by policy as to who can access it and who should access it and who cannot access it. So I think it would require a good coupling between the technological innovations that we are aware of and some very nice policies to make it happen.
Yeah, Dr. Romine, do you have any comments about when you engage with some of your foreign colleagues in this? You know, do they face a very different set of attitudes as in the United States?
Well, certainly that's true. For example, as you know, the GDPR in Europe envisions a very different way of approaching protections for privacy than we currently have here in the United States. But that said, one of the reasons that the privacy framework that we've developed is regulation agnostic and even technology agnostic is that we want it to be adaptable, usable around the globe, and to be able to provide assurance that if you follow these guidelines, you have evidence to support your complying with whatever regulatory regime you happen to be in at any given time.
Thank you. I will now recognize Representative Obernolte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Foster. I'd like to continue our discussion about the kind of the ethical philosophy around privacy. And a couple of interesting things have come up in this last round of questioning about, like, how do we safeguard this privacy, you know, from a 30,000-foot view level. And, you know, I think there's some things that could work and some things that probably won't work. I think, Dr. Ross, you were mentioning disclosure, which I used to think that was a great idea. And then I started looking at end user license agreements for software, you know. I mean, it's like, they're pages and pages, people scroll through, they click agree at the end. No one ever reads that. So what good is it possibly going to do for us to add another paragraph that says, here's how we're going to use the facial data that you give us? You know, it's, Yeah, there was an episode of South Park a couple of years ago when it was a parody of one of the characters that inadvertently given Apple the right to do medical experimentation on him, you know, and his friends were kidding him. What, you just clicked that and signed it without reading it? Who does that? And the answer is everybody does that, right? So I don't think disclosure is the answer. I think maybe control over who has access to the data. You know, if I give my data to Apple, you know, for use for a certain purpose, you know, the fact that Apple should not give that data to somebody else to use for a different purpose, I think that's, you know, that's closer to the mark. But I mean, I think ultimately we're not going to find a real regulatory solution to this problem without looking at the things we're trying to prevent. You know, it's what attorneys call the parade of horribles. So I want to ask about that. And I guess, Dr. Romine, I'll ask you about this. So like, we're entering this era when anonymity is a lot less than it used to be. And that's going to be true regardless of what approach we as a government take towards privacy. So can you walk us through like the worst things if we fail to act, like the worst things that can happen? Because I think those are the ones that we have to be trying to prevent.
Fair enough. I will say figuring out what the worst things are might take me some time, but some of the things that I've already alluded to, this idea of organizations making decisions based on inferences from biometric data that disadvantage certain groups over others.
Okay, let me stop you there though, because we've had that problem. I mean, there's ethics around AI algorithms in hiring right now that we're dealing with that issue, right? But absolutely. I think, I mean, the solution to that issue focus on the fact that behavior is already illegal. So, I mean, like if I'm going to kill somebody, it's equally illegal for me to kill them with a knife or a gun. You know, the tool doesn't matter. The act is what matters. So why is that different in the case of privacy?
So I don't think it's so much different as it is. It's a consequence of the lack of privacy or privacy compromise. So privacy in this case, or the compromise of privacy, a privacy event, would lead to that activity. There are other things that I could imagine. There are, you know, aggregate societal decisions that are made that may be predicated on aggregate data that violates privacy considerations. Those kinds of things. You know, policies may be instituted that are inimical to certain populations as a result of issues relating to privacy, or biometrics. So, you know, in all of these cases, what we've discerned is that there is no technological solution that's going to solve the privacy problem, and there is no purely, I think there is no purely policy solution that's going to solve the problem. It's an ongoing joint effort of providing appropriate technologies for improving privacy protections and matching those with appropriate policy decisions that can prevent some of these tragedies.
Sure, yeah, I agree with you, but I definitely think that in crafting policy, we need to be looking at asking ourselves the question: what problem are we trying to solve? What are we trying to avoid? And, you know, merely focusing on anonymity, I think, is a fool's errand, because we have a lot less anonymity now than we used to, and we will. There's nothing we can do about that. I think there's a big difference between when we're talking about the parade of horribles, whether or not it's government violating people's privacy or other entities, because government has a coercive power that other entities don't. And, you know, if you want parade of horribles, look at what China does with some of the personal data they have for people, right? So that's the top of my list of parade of horribles. But I don't think we're going to get there, you know, without from a policy framework standpoint, without thinking about the problem we're trying to solve holistically. Anyway, it's a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we're going to continue having it over the next couple of years. But thank you very much, Chairman Foster, for having the hearing. I've really enjoyed it. I yield back.
Thank you, and we'll now recognize our lawyer in residence for 5 minutes, Representative Perlmutter.
And I think Mr. Obernolte is really sort of focusing on the question of the day. I remember serving in the state Senate about 20 plus years ago, and we were just trying to have an internet within the Colorado legislature, and and something came up and we were talking about social security numbers and should we release them and all that stuff. And you know, for privacy purposes. And I said, well, I was sort of being cavalier. I said, there's no such thing as privacy. And kind of your point, there's no such thing as anonymity. And it's only grown since in the last 30 years. So the question is, I think from a policy perspective, technologically, you know, we can address things. And as Ms. Wright said, you know, you give up some things to get some things. You can make it tougher for a cyber criminal or for somebody to use your data, but you're giving up some efficiency or some ease of use in the process. The Supreme Court in several decisions, none of which I like, and the one I like the least is the reversal of Roe versus Wade, but they basically say that under the United States Constitution, there is no such thing as a right to privacy. And I don't know, I mean, I want to feel secure that when I go buy something spontaneously, that doesn't alert everybody under the sun to something, or when I walk by a grocery store or gas station or something, that all of a sudden that doesn't, you know, send off all sorts of perlmutters in the neighborhood. Let's sell him X, or let's get him, you know. I guess this is for everybody, including my two colleagues. I don't know. So I think Jay's question, what is it that we're trying to solve? What do we want here? I mean, do we want to create a right to privacy now that the Supreme Court says there isn't such a thing? We certainly legislatively can say something like that. And then how far do we want to take it? I think those are the questions. And then for the technologists, you know, help us put that into place, knowing that technology is going to evolve and change, and things that we thought were in place will be replaced. I don't know, that's just a sort of Ed Perlmutter thinking based on Jay Obernoldti's line of questioning. So I don't know if anybody's got a thought. I think that, you know, it's the responsibility of the technologists and you, Ms. Wright, as the director of the, you know, kind of this agency that thinks about this stuff, to say, okay, from a technology standpoint, we can do some things if you guys give us some clear direction. And I think Bill's trying to do that on some of his digital legislation. And I think Jay has some stuff too. So I don't know, Dr. Foster, I'm going to turn it back to you, and you can do with my 2 minutes whatever you wish.
Oh, all right. So that's interesting. You know, this is all right, here, I'll ask you a question. So much of this is going to have to do with our cell phones. So Dr. Romine, is there good coordination and communication with the manufacturers of the cell phones? You know, there's incredible AI horsepower being built into the next generation of smartphones, but not all of it's inside the secure enclave where you'll have some idea that it's trusted computing. And so are you having thoughtful interactions, or do you get the feeling that they're just trying to set up a walled garden that keeps everyone's privacy information under their control?
So at NIST, we work with a very large and broad cross-section of technology, including cell phone manufacturers and providers. An interesting, having further reflection on the Ranking Member Obernoldti's question about significant harms. You know, one of the significant harms I can imagine is either through cell phone tracking or face recognition, you know, cameras that are, you know, street cameras and so on. Someone trying to access, you know, safe and reliable medical services, whether it's psychiatric services or something else, suddenly, you know, that becomes a matter of public record. Someone has now sort of been outed because of biometrics information, because of privacy information, trying to obtain services. So this is another one of these very serious potential issues. But yes, we're working in discussion with cell phone manufacturers and other advanced technology firms all the time.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. And wow, here we could go on all afternoon on this. I just really I suppose I have to close the hearing now, but before we bring the hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee. It is really valuable for us in Congress as we struggle with all the policy issues here on biometrics and privacy, that we have access to real quality experts so we can understand the technological reality and the feasibility of things and don't generate legislation based on wishful thinking instead of technical reality. Now, the record here will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any additional questions that the committee may ask the witnesses. And the witnesses are now excused and the hearing is now adjourned.